It was Tuesday morning, the 18th of November, 1958, at 40 minutes past 6, and the sun was not up yet over Sumner Falls, Colorado, when Deputy Carl Wickett came to unlock the courthouse and found 6 men sitting in the dirt. He stopped on the bottom step with the key still in his hand. They were sitting in a row against the cold ground outside the sheriff's door, the whole Kesler gang, all 6 of them, the toughest men in the county, the men nobody in Sumner Falls would look in the eye. Their hands were tied behind their backs with baling wire, twisted tight and neat, the way a man ties a thing he means to hold. They were sore. They were filthy. One of them, Dutch, the hired man, had a nose broken flat across his face and blood dried black down his chin. Roy Kessler, the biggest of them, the one who ran the whole rotten business, sat at the end with one eye swollen shut and his jaw set like a man who has decided he will die before he explains himself. They were not badly hurt. That was the first strange thing. Bruised, humiliated, stiff with cold, but every one of them breathing, every one of them awake. Whoever had done this had not meant to kill them, had, in fact, gone to some trouble not to. Carl Wickett stood there in the grey dark and could not make his mouth work. Pinned to the front of Roy Kessler's coat, driven through the wool with a horseshoe nail, was a note. Carl leaned down and read it without touching it. These men have been taking from this town for 2 years. The ledger in the black truck will tell you the rest. That was all. No name, no signature, just the truth, pinned to the chest of the man it damned. Carl Wickett looked up and down the street. Main Street of Sumner Falls lay empty in the blue dark. The hardware store shut, the diner not yet lit, the whole town asleep. 6 of the hardest men in the county had been taken in the night, tied like calves, and walked to the courthouse steps, and not one soul in Sumner Falls had seen a thing. Not one had heard a thing, or if they had, they'd pulled the blanket up over their heads and told themselves it was the wind. It would take the town of Sumner Falls 40 years to learn who had been standing on that street in the dark. Nobody in Sumner Falls even knew he'd been in town. Here is the story. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand what the Kesslers were. Because they were not outlaws. Outlaws would have been easier. The Kesslers were legitimate. That was the whole horror of it. There were 5 brothers, Roy at the top, then Vern, then Cole, then the twins Amos and Lee, and one hired man named Dutch. And on paper they were businessmen. They held the county contract for the stockyard scale. They held the hay hauling contracts. Every head of cattle that got weighed for sale in that part of the High Plains got weighed on a Kesler scale. And every bale that moved to market moved on a Kesler truck. It was all stamped and signed and legal. And it was all a robbery. Here is how it worked. When a rancher brought his cattle to the scale, Roy Kessler read the weight, and Roy Kessler's scale ran light. Not by much. Never by so much that a man could be sure. 40 pounds a head. 60. Enough to steal a fortune over 2 years, and never enough that any one man could stand up and swear to it. And then there was the hauling fee, a charge the Kesslers had simply invented, and took out of every check, and dared anybody to refuse. And if a man did refuse, if a rancher got his back up and threatened to drive his cattle 2 counties over, or worse, to talk, then some night that man's barn burned. 2 barns had burned already. Della Ruiz was a widow who ran her late husband's place alone, 40 head and a bad back and a mortgage. For 2 years, every load she brought to the scale came up 400 pounds light. She knew it. She could not prove it. And she had no husband to stand behind her, and no barn she could afford to lose. Ott Berryman was 74, had ranched that country since before the roads were paved, and in the autumn of 1957 he had said out loud, at the feed store, that Roy Kessler was a thief. 9 days later his barn burned to the ground with a season's hay inside it, and Ott Berryman had not spoken a full sentence to another human being since. He just went quiet, the way an old tree goes quiet after the lightning hits it. And then there was Sheriff Hollis Dray, 61 years old, not corrupt, that has to be said plain, because it matters. Hollis Dray had never taken a Kesler dollar in his life. He was simply outmatched and afraid, and he knew it, and he hated himself for it, with a bitterness that had eaten 11 pounds off him in 2 years. He had no witnesses, he had no evidence, he had a scale that maybe ran light, and 2 barns that maybe caught fire by accident, and 6 hard men who looked at him across the street with lazy smiles that said, "You know, and we know you know, and you'll do nothing, because there's nothing you can do. That was Sumner Falls, in November of 1958, a whole town that knew exactly what was being done to it, and could not move. Everyone knew. Nobody moved. Hold on to that, because that paralysis is the thing that makes the rest of this story land. When you understand how frozen that town was, how completely, how shamefully frozen, then you'll understand why what happened on that Tuesday morning was not just a surprise, it was a kind of miracle, and a mystery the town could not let go of for 40 years. Sheriff Hollis Dray found the black truck parked behind the feed store, with the keys still in it, and behind the seat, wrapped in an oilcloth, he found the ledger. He sat down on the running board in the cold morning light and turned the pages, and his hands began to shake, not from fear now, but from something closer to awe. It was all there. 2 years of it. Every load, every rancher, the real weight on one side of the column, and the weight Roy Kessler had called out on the other, and the difference pocketed. All of it in Roy Kessler's own square, careful hand. The man had kept books on his own thieving. He'd been so certain no one could touch him that he'd written it all down, like an honest merchant. It was enough to convict all 6, enough to convict them 10 times over. But that only deepened the mystery, because how had a stranger, and Dray was already sure it was a stranger, known the ledger was in that truck? How had he known where to look, in a town he'd never set foot in? The Kesslers wouldn't say. That was the second strange thing, and it gnawed at the whole town. Dray had them in the cells by 7, and he questioned them one at a time, and not one of them would tell him a single word about the man who'd done it. And Dray understood, after a while, that it wasn't loyalty keeping them quiet. It was shame. These were men whose entire power in that county rested on being feared, and to admit what had happened to them was to admit they were not to be feared at all. Whatever had been done to them in the dark had broken something in them worse than a nose. Roy Kessler said exactly one thing. Dray asked him straight, "How many were there? How many men came for you?" And Roy Kessler, staring at the wall with his one good eye, said, "Wasn't but one of him." That was all. He never said another word about it as long as he lived. Wasn't but one of him, one man. 6 of them, 6 armed, hard, dangerous men, taken by one. That sentence went out of the courthouse, and through the diner, and down Main Street, and out onto every ranch in the county by nightfall, and Sumner Falls could not stop turning it over. The theories started before the sun went down. It was a hired gun out of Denver, some said. Somebody one of the burned-out ranchers had scraped together the money to bring in. It was a brother, said others. Ott Berryman had a brother back east, didn't he? A hard man, come to settle accounts. It was federal men, said a third bunch, working quiet, and this was just the start. And then, for about a week, came the worst theory of all, that it was somebody local, that one of their own had done it and was walking among them, saying nothing. And that theory poisoned the town for 7 days. Neighbors looked sideways at neighbors. Men studied each other's knuckles for bruises at the feed store. A town that had been frozen by fear got briefly frozen by suspicion instead, everybody wondering who among them had the sand to do a thing none of them had dared. There was only one physical clue. On the courthouse steps, half trodden into the frozen dirt, Deputy Wickett found a pocket knife. A good one, worn smooth with years of a man's thumb, the bone handle gone yellow and the blade honed down narrow from a lifetime of sharpening. It was not a Kesler knife, Dray checked, held it up to each of the 6, and watched their faces, and none of them knew it. Nobody in town claimed it either. Sheriff Hollis Dray put the pocket knife in the top drawer of his desk, and he did not know it yet, but he had just put away the only thing that stranger left behind, and it would sit in one drawer or another for the next 40 years. Let me stop the story here for just a moment. Where are you watching from tonight? Do me a kindness and drop your state in the comments. I like to know where these stories travel. And let me ask you something, honest. Have you ever lived somewhere where everybody knew exactly what was wrong, knew who was doing it, knew it was happening, and nobody moved? Where the wrong thing just went on because everyone was waiting for somebody else to be the one. If you've ever lived in a place like that, type the words "one man" in the comments. I think more of us have than would ever say so out loud. Now, let's find out what really happened that night. Here is the thing about Hollis Dray. He was not brave, he'd have told you that himself, but he was a good lawman in the ways that don't require bravery. He was patient, he was thorough, and over the weeks that followed, piecing it together from scraps, from the few people who'd seen anything at all. Sheriff Dre reconstructed the night of November 17th, the way a man puts together a broken plate, one fragment at a time, never quite sure of the whole until near the end. The first fragment came from the diner. Ada, who waited the tables at the Sumner Falls cafe, remembered him. A tall man, grey at the temples, come in around 4 in the afternoon the day before. He'd taken the corner booth. He'd ordered coffee and then more coffee, and a plate of stew he ate slow, and he'd sat there better than 2 hours saying almost nothing at all, just listening to the ranchers at the counter grouse low about the scale, listening to the whole town's quiet, bitter, beaten talk. Ada said he had a way of being still that made you forget he was there, and when he finally paid, he'd asked her exactly one question, in a low, easy voice, like it was nothing at all. He'd asked, "Who runs the scale?" That was the whole of it. He'd left $2 on a 40-cent check and walked out into the dusk, and Ada hadn't thought another thing about him until the sheriff came asking. The second fragment came from the stockyard night watchman, a half-deaf old fellow named Pruitt. Around 11 that night, Pruitt said, he'd heard the office door, heard it, not seen it, and come around the corner of the pens to find a light moving inside the Kesler office. Not a lamp. Matches. Somebody was in there, striking match after match and reading by them. Pruitt, being half-deaf and wholly sensible, decided it was no business of his and went back to his stove. But he'd seen the shape of a man at the desk, bent over the ledger, turning pages by matchlight, patient as Sunday. That was how the stranger knew what was in the books. He'd read them. He'd sat in the thieves' own office in the dark and read 2 years of their thieving by the light of a matchbox. The third fragment Dre never got from a witness. He read it off the men themselves, off their injuries, off the wrecked office, off the marks in the dirt. He put it together the way a tracker reads sign. The Kesslers had caught him. That much was plain. Somewhere in the reading of that ledger, they'd come on him. All 6, roused and armed and certain. 6 hard men against one stranger caught red-handed in their own office. It should have ended one way. It ended another. From the way the office was smashed, from the particular injuries, Dre reconstructed it as best a man could. The stranger had taken the first 2 before the rest even understood the fight had started. Dre could tell from Vern's jaw and Cole's ribs that those 2 went down early and went down hard, in the first 2 or 3 seconds, before anyone had drawn a breath to shout. Then, the other 4 had come on him all at once, and he'd gone down under the weight of them. There were the marks of that on the floor. And then, this was the part Dre turned over and over. He had gotten back up. Under 4 men, he had gotten up. But here is the fragment that mattered most to Hollis Dre. Here is the thing he could not stop thinking about, the thing that changed how he saw the whole business, and maybe changed how he saw his own life. 6 armed men, and not one shot fired. Every one of the Kesslers carried a gun. Dre knew it, the whole county knew it. There were pistols found in that office and a rifle in the rack. And in the middle of a 6-on-1 fight for his life, in the dark, a stranger had taken all 6 of them down and tied them with wire, and never once, from first to last, had a gun come into it. He had done the whole thing with his hands. And more than that, he had done it without killing a single man, without so much as crippling one. A broken nose, some cracked ribs, a swollen eye. That was the worst of it. Dre said it aloud to his deputy, standing in that wrecked office, and it came out almost like a prayer. 6 armed men and not one shot fired, he said. He did it all with his hands, and he did it without killing anybody. You understand what that takes, Carl? That doesn't take strength. Well, it takes strength. But mostly it takes deciding beforehand. A man doesn't hold back like that in the heat of it unless he already decided, before he ever walked in, what kind of thing he was and wasn't willing to do. He came in here having already made up his mind he wasn't going to kill anybody. And then he kept that promise while 6 men tried to kill him. And here Dre stopped and shook his head. I don't know that I could have kept it. The fourth fragment was the walk, because the stockyard office was a good half-mile from the courthouse. And somehow, in the black middle of the night, one man had gotten 6 of them onto their feet, hands wired behind them, and walked them that whole half-mile down through the sleeping town to the courthouse steps. 6 unwilling men, in the dark, and nobody heard a thing. Except, and Dre came to understand this slowly, and it shamed him, some of them had heard. A light had come on in the Petersons' upstairs window that night, and gone off again. The lad dog had barked itself hoarse around midnight and been hushed. 2 or 3 people, it turned out, had heard something pass down Main Street in the dark. And every one of them had done what the whole town had trained itself to do for 2 years. They had pulled the blanket up and told themselves it was nothing. Nobody heard, because nobody wanted to hear. And there Sheriff Hollis Dray's reconstruction stopped, because there was one thing he never could explain, and never did, as long as he lived. How does one man walk 6 down a half-mile of open street in the dark, 6 of them, with their legs free? Anyone might have run, or turned on him, or scattered into the night. 6 against 1, and a long, dark road, and every chance in the world to break, and not one of them did. Something happened on that walk, or something was true about that man, that made 6 hard and desperate men decide, each in his own heart, that running was not a thing they were going to try. Dray never learned what. He never even had a good theory, and in time he stopped wanting one. Because he came to understand that the thing you cannot explain is the thing that turns a story into a legend. The gap is where the awe lives. And 40 years of Sumner Falls telling it around their stoves and their supper tables would never fill that gap, and never should. Now here is the part that matters, not the fight, the morning after. Because the fight was over in 90 seconds in a dark office, and no one saw it, and it changed nothing by itself. What changed the town was what the town did next. With the ledger in the sheriff's hands and all 6 Kesslers behind iron, something broke loose in Sumner Falls. Something that had been frozen solid for 2 years. It broke the way river ice breaks, all at once, with a sound. Della Ruiz testified first. The widow walked into the courthouse 3 days later in her good church dress, sat down in front of the county attorney, and told 2 years of it in a steady voice. Every short wait, every invented fee, £400 a load stolen from a woman with a bad back and a mortgage, and no one to stand behind her. She had never dared say a word of it while the Kesslers walked free. Now she said all of it. And once Della Ruiz had gone first, the rest found their nerve. 11 more ranchers testified after her. And then, in the second week, and this was the thing that made grown men in Sumner Falls have to look away and clear their throats, Ott Berryman came in. Ott Berryman, who had not spoken a full sentence in over a year, not since the night his barn burned. He sat down, and he opened his mouth, and in a voice like a rusty gate, he told the court about the fire, and about the man he'd seen walking away from it, and he talked for 2 hours, a year of silence coming out of him all at once. When he finished, the old man wept, and he was not ashamed to. Roy Kessler got 12 years, the others got 6 to 10, and the county took back its scale. As for Sheriff Hollis Dray, his arc is the one I want you to hold on to, because on the morning after the arrests, before any of the testifying started, Hollis Dray sat down and wrote out his resignation. He was 61 years old and sick with shame. A stranger had walked into his town and done, in one night, the job Dray had been too afraid to do for 2 years. He couldn't bear to wear the badge another day. He had the letter written and signed, and then he tore it up. He tore it up because he decided that quitting was just one more way of waiting for somebody else to move, and he was done, forever, with waiting for somebody else to move. Hollis Dray served 11 more years as sheriff of that county, and they were the best 11 years of his service, and he was never afraid again. Or if he was afraid, and he sometimes was, he never again let the fear decide. A stranger did my job for me in the dark, he told his deputy once, years on. I made myself a promise I'd never let that happen twice, and I never did. There is one more thing to say here, and it is the thing the whole story turns on. That stranger could have driven on. Think about it plainly. He was passing through, a man with a plate of stew and a cup of coffee, and someplace else to be. It was not his town. They were not his people. 6 armed men against 1 is exactly how a stranger gets himself killed in a place nobody will ever miss him from, and buried in a county that will never know his name. Every single thing about the easy road pointed one direction. Keep your head down, finish your coffee, and drive on into the dark. The easy thing was the invisible thing. Nobody would ever have known he'd been there. Nobody would ever have blamed him. That is what makes what he did what it was. He chose the hard, dangerous, thankless thing, in a town that would never even learn his name, and then he made sure it wouldn't. Let me stop once more, because this is the heart of it. Have you ever waited for someone braver than you to go first? Have you ever been the whole town, one of the people who knew what was wrong and saw it and told yourself it wasn't yours to fix? And have you ever been helped by someone who then slipped away before you could so much as thank them? Someone who wanted the good thing done more than they wanted the credit for doing it. Here is what I've come to believe, and it's the whole reason I wanted to tell you this one. A town doesn't change because one man wins a fight in the dark. A fight in the dark changes nothing. A town changes because one man proves it could be done. That's all he really gave Sumner Falls. Not a rescue, a proof. He showed them the thing they'd told themselves was impossible was only hard. And once a thing is only hard instead of impossible, ordinary people find they can do it after all. Stay with me. We're almost to the part nobody knew. The story became the town's story, and like all such stories, it grew. For 40 years they told it in Sumner Falls, around stoves in the winter, on porches in the summer, to children who grew up and told it to their own. And with the telling it got bigger, the way true things do when they pass mouth to mouth. Within a few years, it wasn't 6 men the stranger had taken, it was 10. Within 20 years, it was 20. Some told it that he was 9 feet tall. Some told it that he vanished into thin air on the courthouse steps. Nobody knew the truth, because nobody knew his name, and so the story was free to become whatever the town needed it to be. It became less a thing that happened, and more a thing the town believed about itself, that in its worst and most frozen hour, somebody had stood up, and so somebody always could. It planted itself deepest in the young. Della Ruiz had a daughter, a girl of 9 that November, who grew up on the story of the night a stranger stood up for her widowed mother in the dark. That girl, Elena Ruiz, grew up and went to the state college and became an agricultural inspector for the state of Colorado, and she spent her whole working life driving from county to county across the high plains, checking the weights and measures, certifying the scales, making dead sure that no widow anywhere in her state got shorted 400 pounds a load ever again. Somebody asked her once why she'd chosen such a dull, unglamorous line of work, and Elena Ruiz said, "Somebody stood up for my mother in the dark, one time. I never learned who. So I stand up for everybody's mother, in the daylight, with a clipboard. It's the same job. It just doesn't need to be done at night anymore." Sheriff Hollis Dray kept the pocket knife in the top drawer of his desk for 11 years, until the day he retired. Then he took it home and kept it in a drawer there for 30 years more. He never learned whose it was, but he could not throw it away. He'd take it out some evenings and open the worn blade and turn it in the lamplight and think about a man he never saw, who did his job for him in the dark and asked for nothing, not even to be known. And the Kesslers. Roy came out of prison after 12 years, a bitter, broken man, and lived out his days angry at a stranger whose face he'd never clearly seen. But the youngest brother, Lee, one of the twins, barely 20 the night it happened, Lee came out different. Prison and shame and a great deal of time to think had turned something over in him. When Lee Kessler got out, he learned the scale trade honestly, and in time he ran a stockyard scale 2 counties over, and he ran it straight as a plumb line for 30 years. And he made a point, all his life, of hiring on the sons and grandsons of the very men his family had robbed, quietly, without ever explaining why. It was the only apology he knew how to make, and he made it every day until he died. Hollis Dray died in the spring of 1998, at the age of 101, the last living soul who'd stood on that street the morning the Kesslers were found. And it was in the going through of his things that the last piece of the mystery finally came to light, 40 years too late for him to know it. His granddaughter, sorting the old man's desk, found the worn, bone-handled pocket knife wrapped in a handkerchief. And wrapped up with it, unopened, was an envelope. The story of the envelope came out later, from a note Dray had scribbled and kept. On the morning the Kesslers were found, someone had left an envelope propped against the courthouse door, and Hollis Dray, in the chaos of that morning, sure it was a crank or a prank from one of the Kessler friends, had shoved it in his coat pocket and forgotten it. He'd carried it home that night, and by the time he remembered it, weeks later, he'd talked himself out of opening it, half afraid it would spoil the mystery he'd come to hold almost sacred. So he'd wrapped it up with the knife and left it sealed, for 40 years. His granddaughter opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a square, unhurried hand, the hand of a man in no rush at all. "Sheriff, by now you've got the ledger, so you know what these men were. I want to set your mind easy on a few things you'll wonder about. I ate my supper in your diner and heard your whole town's silence, and I read their books by the light of a match. And yes, they caught me at it, and that was fine. The getting caught was fine. I wanted that ledger in your hands, not mine, and a man who's just passing through can't put a thief in a courtroom. Only a town can do that. Only you could do that. Your town didn't need a stranger, Sheriff. Don't ever believe it did. It needed one morning, just one, where somebody proved the thing could be done. That's all I gave you. I bought you the morning. Everything after was yours, and I hear you've been doing it. Keep on. Don't wait for the next fellow passing through. There won't always be one, and there doesn't need to be. A fellow who was just passing through. There was no name. But the granddaughter, being of a curious mind and a modern age, took the letter to a man who knew handwriting the way Dre had known his county. And the square, unhurried hand on that 40-year-old sheet of paper was matched, carefully, and past any real doubt, to the hand of a man born Marion Robert Morrison, in Winterset, Iowa, before the whole world came to know him by another name. Today, the pocket knife, and the letter, and a single page torn from Roy Kessler's ledger sit together in a glass case in the small county museum at Sumner Falls. The card beneath them tells the story of the autumn the town took itself back. It names Della Ruiz, who testified first. It names Ott Berryman, who found his voice. It names Sheriff Hollis Dre, who tore up his resignation and served 11 more years. It does not name the stranger. That was his wish, plainly stated, and the town has honored it for a quarter century now. The one man who did the most, left off the card on purpose, exactly the way he wanted. 6 of the hardest men in the county were found tied in the dirt on a cold Tuesday morning, and it took a whole town 40 years to learn who had been standing on that dark street. And when they finally learned it, the answer only deepened the wonder, because he had never wanted them to know at all. He had wanted only for the thing to be done, and for the town to be the one that did it. Somebody did it. That was the whole answer, for 40 years. And you know what? It was enough. It was always enough. They don't make men like that anymore. But they made a few. And as long as we tell their stories, around the stove, on the porch, to the children who'll tell them again, they're never really gone. If this story moved you, type one man in the comments and tell me the name of a place that needed somebody to prove it could be done. Share this with a person who taught you not to wait for the next fellow passing through. And subscribe, and stay with us, for more true-hearted stories of the quiet ones who did the hard thing and asked for nothing. Because they don't make men like John Wayne anymore. But oh, they made a few.